Imagine a world with no bakeries, no ovens or flour sitting on a shelf, no sandwiches, toast, or birthday cake. For most of human history, that was simply reality. And yet today, some version of bread exists in nearly every culture on Earth, but baked in 1,000 different shapes, from a flat disc cooked on a hot stone to a soft loaf.
Air-filled loaf pulled from a modern oven.
So where did this all begin? Who looked at a wild side, grass seed, and somehow saw bread hiding inside it? The surprising answer is that bread is older than farming itself, older than pottery, older, in some sense, than settled human life as we usually picture it. For most of human history, people didn't grow their own food at all. They followed it, moving with the seasons, gathering wild plants, hunting animals, never staying anywhere long enough to plant a crop and wait for it to grow. Grains existed in this world too, wild wheat, wild barley, growing in scattered patches across the landscape, but they weren't crops in any modern sense. So how do you turn a handful of tough, dry, wild seeds into something you can actually eat? This is where the story gets genuinely surprising. Archaeological evidence recovered from a site called Shubaika 1 in what is now Jordan includes charred food remains dated to roughly 14,400 years ago, thousands of years before agriculture existed anywhere in the region. Researchers examining these remains identified them as the burnt remnants of a flatbread-like food, made from ground wild cereals and club-rush tubers, mixed with water and cooked over a fire. In other words, hunter-gatherers, people with no farms, no domesticated wheat, no permanent villages, appear to have already been making something that looks remarkably like bread. If people were already making bread before farming existed, why did anyone bother inventing agriculture at all? The answer comes down to a simple, brutal problem. Wild grain wasn't reliable. It grew in scattered patches, ripened briefly, and had to be found and gathered by hand, season after season, with no guarantee any single patch would still be there, or fruitful, the following each year. Grinding it into something edible was hard, physical work too. A wild grain seed had to be crushed between two stones, over and over, just to break it down into something close to flour, an exhausting task that could occupy hours of a person's day for a relatively small amount of food in return. So people began doing something that would eventually change everything. Instead of only gathering wild grain wherever it happened to grow, they started deliberately planting it, tending it, and harvesting it in the same place, year after year. Over many generations, through both deliberate selection and unintentional pressure from harvesting methods, and the plants themselves began to change, favoring characteristics like seeds that stayed attached to the plant instead of scattering to the wind, making the crop easier to gather in bulk. This is the shift researchers refer to as domestication, and it turned an unpredictable wild resource into something communities could depend on season after season. It also tied people to the land in a way gathering never had. A family that planted a field in spring had a reason to still be standing in that same spot come harvest. Something that would have felt almost unthinkable to earlier generations who simply followed the food wherever it happened to grow. Now that a reliable source of grain existed, a new problem took its place. How do you turn a growing pile of harvested grain into something a whole community can actually eat day after day? This is where the grinding stone becomes one of the most important tools in early human history, even though it rarely gets remembered that way.
Early communities relied on what's often called a saddle quern, a large, flat stone base paired with a smaller handheld stone, dragged back.
Labor in many ancient societies, based on skeletal evidence, showing distinctive wear patterns linked to this repetitive motion. But it worked, transforming raw grain into something that could be mixed with water, shaped by hand, and cooked, and cooked.
And once that dough existed, the simplest possible method of cooking it was already sitting right there in front of every hearth. Flatten the dough and lay it directly onto a hot stone or the heated wall of a simple clay oven. This is almost certainly how the earliest breads were made for the
Thousands of years, flat, unleavened, cooked quickly, eaten the same day. Simple, reliable, but also, in a very real sense,
still missing something. Because at some point, someone left dough sitting out a little too long.
And what they found when they came back would change bread forever. Flour and water.
Left exposed to open air for any length of time, will naturally begin to attract wild yeast and bacteria drifting invisibly through the environment. Given enough time, that mixture starts to bubble, to rise, to change texture entirely. Nobody could have understood the biology behind it. Microscopic organisms feeding on the starches and releasing gas as a byproduct. But they could absolutely see and taste the result. Dough that had been left standing rose higher, baked lighter, and tasted noticeably different from anything made fresh the same day. And once someone noticed that difference, the logical next step wasn't hard to imagine. Saving back a small piece of that active is widely credited with some of the earliest strong evidence of this discovery being deliberately harnessed rather than stumbled into by accident. Egyptian bread making and beer brewing appear to have been closely linked activities, both relying on domonity fermentation, and it's likely that the same wild yeasts moving between bakeries and breweries played a role in both. Archaeological finds from ancient Egypt include specialized conical bread molds and tomb paintings depicting bakers kneading dough, shaping loaves, and tending
Ovens, suggesting bread production had become organized and skilled labor, not just a household task. But if leavened,
dough baked better in an enclosed space than directly on an open stone, that raised an obvious new question. How do you build something that traps heat evenly all the way around the dough instead of just scorching one side of it? The answer took shape in the form of the enclosed clay oven, sometimes referred to by the general term tanur in the ancient Near East, a rounded, dome-like structure built from clay, heated from within, with dough slapped directly against its hot inner walls to bake. This design solved a problem the open hot stone method never could: even, consistent dough on nearly every side, producing bread that rose more evenly and baked more thoroughly than anything cooked on a flat, exposed surface. With reliable grain, functioning mills, an understanding of fermentation, and ovens built specifically for the job, bread stopped being just food. It became something closer to infrastructure. In ancient Egypt, bread functioned as a form of currency in its own right. Laborers working on major state projects, including the very construction, crews responsible for building monumental structures like the pyramids, were regularly paid and been paid in rations of bread and beer.
Evidence that this staple food had become deeply woven into the basic economic structure of the society, not simply something eaten at
home. Large-scale, state-organized bakeries appear to have existed specifically to produce bread at the volume required to feed these enormous labor forces. But it was in ancient Rome, centuries later, where bread-making scaled into something resembling genuine industry. Roman bakers, known as pistores, formed organized professional guilds, and baking itself became a respected, specialized trade, rather than something handled purely at home. Archaeological evidence, including the remains of bakeries excavated at sites like Pompeii, reveals large stone mills, several of them together in a single building, powered by donkeys or horses walking in constant circles to grind flour at a scale no household quern could ever match. Bread had moved out of the family kitchen entirely and into something closer to a small factory, with dedicated grinding rooms, dedicated ovens, and workers whose entire livelihood depended on producing loaves for people they would never personally meet. Rome went even further, developing state-subsidized grain and bread distribution for its urban population, a system historians often refer to as the grain dole, an early example of food distribution organized directly by government policy, aimed at keeping the population of a sprawling capital city consistently fed. So think about the full distance this story travels. A wild grass seed, gathered by hand, and crushed between two stones by people who had never planted a single crop. A domesticated grain, deliberately grown, harvested, and stored season after season. A lump of dough, left out by accident, and transformed by invisible organisms nobody could see or explain. A dome-shaped clay oven, engineered specifically to trap heat evenly around rising dough. And eventually, entire industries, donkey-powered mills, professional bakers' guilds, government, subsidized bread lines, feeding tens of thousands of people in cities that could never have grown so large, without a reliable, mass-produced food source at their core. None of this happened all at once, and none of it happened because one person somewhere had a single flash of genius. It happened because, over thousands of years, in more than one region entirely, people kept running into the same basic problem: how to turn a handful of hard, inedible seeds into something a body could actually use, and kept finding slightly better answers. 1. Generation quietly building on whatever the last one had already figured out. Today, walking into a bakery and picking up a 13 decision the tarts, soft, warm loaf feels almost entirely unremarkable. But that loaf carries an unbroken thread stretching back to hunter-gatherers, crouched beside an open fire, grinding wild seeds between two stones, thousands of years before anyone had ever planted a single crop on purpose. And maybe that's the real story hiding inside something as ordinary as a piece of bread.
Some of humanity's most essential inventions weren't dramatic, sudden breakthroughs at all. They were slow, patient answers to a very simple
question, repeated by countless hands across thousands of years, until something as basic as crushed grain and water quietly became one of the most important foods in human history.